Welcome back to the Doomer Optimism podcast. We have Brendan from Posterity Ciderworks here and Peter Allen co-hosting with me. I just thought Brendan hasn't been on. We've talked on Twitter quite a bit. I thought it would be good to give him an opportunity to talk about his whole business and his project and his orientation, and then to critically interrogate all of those things and how things work, both from my end and from Peter's end, who's doing something similar but different products. So welcome, Brendan. I'll let you start by introducing yourself and talking a little bit about Posterity Ciderworks, and then we'll just sort of jump into conversation.
Awesome. Well, thanks. It's cool to be here. So yeah, my name is Brendan. You might also know me as Intractable Lion on Twitter. And yeah, so we have a cidery. We focus on low intervention, as additive free as possible cider. We want to make stuff that reflects the place that it's actually grown. And a lot of time that means finding abandoned trees, old orchards, wild stuff. And we're in California where it doesn't rain. And so we actually do get some pretty cool climatic effects. And microclimate is real, terroir is real, and we really try to highlight that wherever we can.
That's cool. So I guess, like, to back up, let's say this is the first episode someone's listening to, and a lot of people come to us totally new to, like, even the concept of regenerative ag, or, you know, I don't know, more ecologically sound production practices. So why, like, what is your philosophy behind how you approach your production and why? And then we can dig in more.
Yeah. That is a really huge topic that I am trying to write a cider and orchard philosophy page for our website, and slightly struggling because it's such an encompassing topic. So yeah, I mean, it really starts with when I started making cider, and we had a little house in Half Moon Bay, just south of San Francisco, and there were 8 apple trees and 3 pear trees on the property. And I started making cider, and it was just really bad cider. And I was not getting the flavors that I wanted. I was getting it wasn't what I wanted. And so I slowly just started chucking the advice and the received wisdom that went into making it. It was the first time I'd made it, so I listened to some friends and people who had more of a homebrew background, or the homebrew community treats it as a really fucked up beer. The wine industry looks at cider as a really messed up wine. And so those things together do not lend themselves to, I would say, the style that I wanted to do, or to something that's really honest about the ingredients that are actually involved. And so I just slowly started diving deeper and deeper into, how do I want to make this? What received wisdom is terrible, and how do we move past that? And yeah, started to develop a style after a couple of years of doing it, that was, in essence, low intervention, without ever even really coming from a natural winemaking space, or the low intervention style is a whole movement around it as a philosophy. And I kind of just got there naturally, through trial and error and figuring out what I actually wanted to be doing, without ever seeing it as a necessarily holistic philosophy to aim for. I just sort of assembled bits and pieces of well, that's a terrible piece of advice, let's do it this way instead. And oh, that's closer to what I want to do. Let's lean into that and go even harder. And so yeah, at this point, every single batch of cider that we do is different. Every tank is unique because it's a different blend of fruit that's coming in from all these various orchards in a given week of harvesting. And in some cases, we get to do really fun stuff like it's a single orchard cider. And in other cases, it's even more granular than that. It's a single tree. And I think that is super interesting. That's what I want to be making. and that just lends itself naturally to the localist style movement, the low intervention movement. The fine winemaking perceives that at its level when it speaks about terroir, and you've got that like, oh, this was clearly grown on a south-facing slope, and like people take the piss out of that for being pretentious, but it's also like real when you do start to get that granular and actually inspect something deeply at that level. It does become real. And I know I've threaded about that in the past, of like just comparing the same apple variety, the Arkansas Black, grown in 3 different locations in the Sierra foothills, with about 35 miles separating all of the various orchards that they're grown in, and how they are distinct from each other, and distinct from the same variety grown conventionally down in the Central Valley. And that's one of those levels of discernment that you lose as scale starts to increase, where like if you're homogenizing, 100 pounds from this orchard, 100 pounds from that orchard, with 3 tons from a mixture of conventional orchards, like that level of discernment vanishes. And it is fake. It's like, no, that's not an effect. What are you talking about? You're crazy, because it's gone now. And so that's one of the beauties of being where we are, is that, if I want to make a 5-gallon batch homebrew style, I'm still making that stuff. And most of our batches are a little bit bigger than that. And we've managed to find a way to still hew to that kind of philosophy of like, let's talk about how this is different from other stuff that you might have seen.
Peter, do you have something to add? I have a kind of a question for you if you don't have something.
No, I mean, I totally get that. I mean, we have similar issues in that, we sell grass-fed beef and we slaughter it multiple times in the year. And, you go to the store and like a pound of hamburgers, a pound of hamburger, like they're all exactly the same, whether, the meat's coming from Australia or New Zealand or California or Texas, like it all kind of tastes the same. But we slaughter different times of the year. So we have, the meat from a beef that's slaughtered in the peak of the growing season, they're fat, they're well marbled, versus one in the winter, they're being eating hay, especially at the end of the winter when the hay starts to lose its nutritional quality, like they're a lot leaner. It actually has more flavor in it. You have to chew more, and people don't necessarily like to chew. So like finding customers that appreciate like the realness of the product as being like from one farm in one place that has variability through the season. People just aren't used to that as a concept. And so, I mean, for us, there's a lot of education that goes along into like, I write a newsletter with our product every month. And so there's a lot of like education, like, well, this is what's going on this month. This is what the weather's been like. This is why, we have this meat available, but not this, or that's why this is going to taste this way instead of this way. And so,
yeah, totally.
Whenever you're doing small scale in the face of big ag and dealing with customers that have only had their entire life with a conventional system, like they don't have any memory of the way it used to be. It's like their grandparents and great grandparents are the last ones to like remember, any other system. So there's a lot of re-education that needs to happen for sure.
Definitely. We probably have a slight advantage with what we're doing in that I get to do tastings with people in the tasting room, and we can kind of walk them through. I get to get way more in detail than anything that would ever fit on a label. And I get to taste stuff side by side, and you can kind of start to guide that perception down to the granular level from what people are used to. And the fun thing is that I found that for the most part, when you get to do that, people understand it. They figure it out really, really fast. Both because what we're doing is so different from the mass market commercial stuff that they've had, and the stuff is very different from, like, each batch is distinct from another batch. I've even got, like, I've done a couple where it's one orchard and we split the batch between 2 different yeasts, and people can see there's a radical difference in the flavor that comes out just by using a different microbe. And yeah, it's really rewarding to see that connection start to happen for people.
That's cool. The thing that I'm interested, one thing I wrote recently for this publication was about how craft culture has become this thing where it's perceived to be like only accessible for high class people. So like either producing it or consuming it. Whereas like historically, some form of craft culture would be some way to get by in a low resource setting, like, you know, being able to produce for yourself. And so it's really frustrating to me because a lot of people will be like, oh, it's all well and good to jam your own, you know, like can your own jams or whatever, but that's just like a bougie thing. And it's just it's very frustrating to me because like, for example, like where I live in Uruguay, a lot of people are involved in small amounts of self-production, and it's people who have less resources who do more of that, which makes sense. So I don't know if you have thoughts on that, either of you, on this high versus low thing. I almost feel like we're in, you know, like just macro, we're in this resource glut where people don't have to do this, obviously. So then they just think it's like either a high class thing or like an extremely low class thing, but it doesn't resonate at all with people in the middle. But I have a feeling that I have a hope that it will come back and be more accessible, and I think it's extremely accessible even if you don't have a ton of resources.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that that's tricky because in a lot of ways, at least for us, like we are a premium brand in terms of our price point. And a lot of that is driven by, in order to fly in the face of the mass market super commercial products that are in a lot of ways artificially cheap, you basically have to, on the one side, put in more effort. And so things have to cost more. But then on the other side, like, you know, it's you're competing against something that is artificially cheap.
Yeah.
And so like from the get-go, you seem like you're too expensive and you're bougie. And then on top of that, there's the fact that it is also harder to do what you're doing at that granular level. Like I spend a lot of time hunting for these places. And when we get to these orchards and stuff that are abandoned, like it's probably 6 to 10 times slower to harvest the same volume of fruit from these places as it would be from a conventional orchard. And the reason we're doing it is because there is something special about that fruit that we think we can highlight. But obviously, you know, 10x your labor costs and try to keep the price flat with something that's subsidized by like cheap petroleum and $10 million facility, like it's you're automatically like way too expensive for people who are expecting, like, you know, cider should come in a can. The can should cost $2. It should be really, really sweet. Ground beef should be like $2 a pound. What do you mean it costs more?
Yeah. My solution to that problem is that both this stuff should be expensive because it has way more labor costs, and also people should be involved in self-production. And if they were on like a homestead scale, or even, you know, at a home scale, then it would be very cheap for them to be like going and gleaning themselves if they wanted to put the labor in and make this stuff themselves at home, like almost free. And then if they want to get it from you, who's like got this huge attention to detail, it should be very expensive. I have this friend on Twitter at Hamilton who's like, I don't know how to price my eggs, like that he's got a really nice homestead that I make at home. Like either they should be like $100 a dozen or free to people I want to give them away to. Like there's no in between.
Yeah, totally.
It's like I put so much effort into them. They should be very expensive if I'm trying to make any money, or I should just give them away to people because I like them. I don't know, Peter, do you have thoughts about this? The high versus low culture thing?
It's a very, you know, this problem penetrates into all dimensions of the economy, right? It's food, it's you know, clothing. If you want to start, you know, we've got a friend that started a wool mill down the road This used to be a very big wool producing area. There were sheep on all these hills. And once World War II happened, like all the grazing stopped and just went to big ag. And it's really difficult because it's either got to be like you're competing with this artificially, petroleum based fibers for wool. And it's like polyester is like free. I mean, it's so cheap versus wool that you have farmers that are taking care of these animals like right now. And it's been this way basically for like 30 years. The cost of getting a sheep shorn for wool costs more than the value of wool that the sheep shearer shears off of that sheep.
Yep.
So
Right.
like, to me, that's like encapsulates this problem, right? Of like, we have all these artificially low prices for the mass market products that everyone is used to. And if you want to do any alternative that's thoughtful, good for the environment, and sort of, provide some kind of meaningful occupation for a human being, then it's going to be this incredibly expensive product. If you want to like grow sheep, shear them, and then knit that wool, like spin the wool into yarn, and then knit the yarn into a sweater, and then sell that sweater. You're going to be a sweater maker, right? If you're going to pay yourself like say $10 an hour, that sweater's got to cost $1,000, maybe more, $1,000, right? I mean, it's
Yeah.
and then you get to that point. You either have to charge $2,000 for it, or you're going to do it as a labor of love, and you're going to give it to your grandma, or you're going to give it to your grandchild, or you're going to give it to your daughter, or whatever. There's no intermediate. And we face that a lot with our beef because it's a high price point relative to what's in Walmart, which is like super artificially cheap. And you also have to fight with the marketing gimmicks of the big corporations, which will label something as, say, grass fed, even though it's coming from a feedlot, right? Or even more benign things. I mean, the corporate headquarters of Organic Valley, the corporation, is just right up the Kickapoo River for me. And they have another brand called Organic Prairie that sells meat. And it's basically culled dairy cows that are fed a high grain diet their whole life. They also import grass-fed. They also have a grass-fed line that they sell. So you can go to our local food co-op and buy a grass-fed hamburger, and it is for like $6 a pound, and it's marketed as a local product because Organic Valley is a local corporation, but 100% of that meat comes from Australia and New Zealand, 100%. So people go in, buy local grass-fed meat for $6 a pound, and then come to me like, what are you doing selling it for $10? Like, you're crazy.
Yeah.
Why would I ever pay that? And it's like, well, there's so many subsidies down the line to like make that work. And so many efficiencies of scale. Like, I'm just one guy on 100 acres. Like, I'm not, a giant multinational corporation. And it's just, unfortunately, it just kind of has to be that way for now. Now, when we look into the future and see like what's coming down the pike, there's a chance that things might shift pretty substantially with increasing energy costs and whatnot, to where a lot of those cheap products are going to become scarce and therefore expensive. And if we can front end this coming crisis by getting more production happening at small scales on the ground by human beings, then there's a chance that we could actually have enough food to feed people in the coming years. But and then all the dynamics change, right? And we're living in a period of time where people are spending the least amount of money for food ever in the history of humanity. Like, it's something like 10% of people's annual income goes towards food. And historically, it's always been like 50% or above. And so if larger dynamics start to change, then our dynamics are going to change as small scale producers, because there's going to need to be a lot more of us, and then people are going to have a lot less money. So it's going to, like, the divergence between these super cheap things and the expensive things, it's like everything's going to be like expensive and or cheap, and because there's not going to be inflation anymore. So things could change, and I'm kind of like playing a little bit of a waiting game where it's like, I understand that right now my only option is to sell to like pretty well, financially enabled people. Like, I can't sell my meat to, in the poor neighborhoods. Like, I just can't do that. But that might actually change in the coming years.
Brendan, I know that you have had quite a bit of interaction with weird bureaucratic label issues, and I would love to hear some inside baseball on that, like just being able to label your products as local, or I don't know how it works in the cider world, so tell us.
Yeah, I mean, so it's very complicated. Yeah, so all alcohol labels get reviewed by a government office, and the issue that we really run into is that um, in the alcohol world, anything that is indicative of place and technique has largely been co-opted by the wine industry. Cider disappeared for like 80 very critical, highly bureaucratized years. And now all of the regulations have essentially been captured. And so we run into issues with like talking about terroir, talking about the place of origin mattering to the flavor. We have to be very oblique about it. And in a lot of cases, it doesn't really wind up on the bottle. It winds up in the spiel that I give people when they show up at the tasting room or when they're shopping for bottles. And I can actually talk about some of that stuff that's part of the process that has an impact, that is part of that, like, consumer education, teaching people to perceive those granular boundaries between places. And yeah, I just have to be very oblique about it because
Wait, so what happens? Like, why can't you say those things? Like, what are the consequences of saying them?
They basically, the government will flag your label and they won't give you approval to print it. And if you do print it, then you face like fines or potentially lawsuit liabilities by making a claim that could be considered false on your label and printing it anyway. Like, so the office is there to protect the consumer from fraud. And the challenge that we wind up with is that I actually can't say things about our cider that are accurate because it would be fraudulent, because those terms are now only allowed to be used to describe wines. And yeah, it's fun.
That's so insane because, like, I mean, your whole mission, like me as an outsider saying, is like about trying to bring cider back, and cider's like this uniquely American thing, not uniquely, but it's hugely heritage American kind of thing. And just like part of your mission is just talking about how this product comes from a place and a set of practices and all of this kind of thing, like, and you're hamstrung to be able to describe that like widespread to the customer via a label because of this like regulatory capture. That's so frustrating.
Yeah. It's not awesome, I would say. But yeah, like, people, the encouraging thing is that people can see it and they do understand it when you get a chance to interface with them face to face about it. It's something that's immediately perceptible if we're doing our job right. It's just a much smaller scale.
Yeah.
It's not like on every label that you can see when you go to the cold case at one of our retailers. It's something that we can talk about more obliquely.
Okay.
And I mean, ideally, like the product stands for itself as being something that is immediately recognizable as being different to a lot of people, even without necessarily getting that one-on-one conversation with me, the person who made it. Yeah, I mean, the hope is just that they open a bottle that they get at the retailer and they say, this is really different. And then they try to find out more about us. And that's where we get to be like, well, you want to know why it's different? This is why.
Yeah. So earlier you were talking about the set of practices, like as you were developing what kind of practices you wanted to use in your production. Is there a sense where, like, I don't know, this is kind of for both of you, but maybe Brendan, you can go first, but is there a sense where you just kind of like get a sense of how things are done conventionally and just like what is inside you governing whether or not to follow those conventional ways of doing things or not? Like, you know, for example, we had this woman, Dow Orion, on, and she was doing restoration ecology work. And she just realized once she got into it that they were just spraying Roundup all over everything. And she was just like, this is horrible. I don't want to take part in this. There's got to be some other way to do this work. And then she went down like a whole path and wrote a whole book like about a different way to do restoration work. So I'm wondering, like, do the set of practices just kind of like reveal themselves to you? And then like a side question that's related, how do you navigate what is good information and what is not good information? Like, it's so hard. You're in this weird world where you know, there's like conventional information, and then there's people experimenting who are like you, but then you don't know how much those people know or if they're like worth following. You know what I mean? Like, that's happening here in Uruguay to us a lot, where we're like, well, what do people do here? And then we're trying to find out, like, well, but have they always done that, or is that something new that they're coming to, that's mixed up with some like also industrial way of thinking or not? Like, so it's just really like a confusing time. So what how are you making decisions basically as you're going forward in your business?
Yeah, so I would say that a lot of it came out of just the straight aesthetics of what we were doing and what I was looking for without really being able to pinpoint it. But yeah, a lot of it was circumstance, and I think we would have gotten to the same place eventually. But essentially, we moved up our timetable pretty dramatically. So I've been making cider for probably 2.5 years or so. I finally made a batch that was good enough that my wife thought it was good, and you know, the wives keep us honest. And she was like, okay, this is actually pretty good, maybe you're not totally crazy. And so we started looking for property, and we found our place, and spent about a year just like, I don't know what we're doing here, like, let's just get a feel for the place. And then we had a revelation about like, okay, I think the orchard should go here. And when the orchard first started going in, I was not super sophisticated in terms of the planting practices. Like, to be really upfront about it, I was like using a fairly, not super standard because it's fallen out of favor, but like not a particularly unusual rootstock. I was using mostly M111 because I had read that it was tolerant of heavy soils and somewhat drought tolerant. And like, cool, that's what we need. Great, let's put it in the ground. And you know, some of those trees, especially the way that we were planting them, even then, you're looking at a first real crop after maybe 5 years in the ground. And then about a year and a half after that, my wife and I both got laid off in the same month, and we were like, I think that's a sign. Like, I think we're done with the Bay Area, man. And so the timetable got pushed up way faster than our orchard actually could have borne anything for us to make cider from. And so at that point, we started looking for those local resources, which had always kind of been in the plan. But yeah, we definitely dialed up the speed on that. And then it's just sort of followed on from there. Like, once you start looking and seeing some of this stuff, it's really hard not to see it and not to go deeper. And so like when you find an orchard that, you know, the trees were planted in the 20s, the last time anybody lived on the property was the 50s, and the trees are still there, they're still cropping, and they've been, you know, essentially they've been dry farmed, they've received no fertilizer, nobody's been pruning them, nobody's done any foliar sprays, nobody's controlling for bugs, and you're getting 400 pounds per tree. Like, you've got that evidence right in front of you of a different way to grow stuff. And yeah, so I just started being fascinated by that, and like, what does it take for an apple tree to hit 50 feet totally ignored for 100 years? And then it's seedling genetics. Like, that's a seedling tree. It's got a taproot. It has a distinctive genetic makeup from its neighbors, so you're controlling for disease in a lot of ways, and it all just starts to bootstrap from there. Of like, yeah, the philosophy just really sort of came together. So now at this point, for the most part, everything that I'm planting is going on at least some seedling rootstocks, because that's what I want. I want stuff that, we're in California. It doesn't rain for 5, 6 months. Um, you don't want to be growing stuff that needs that steady trickle of water every day, the way the dwarf orchards down in the Central Valley are planted. They're putting 700 trees per acre. Each tree is getting a gallon a day. They can't find any of their own water because the tree's bred to crop in 2 to 3 years. It's growing maybe a foot down into the soil, maybe 2 feet, 3 feet if you're really, really lucky. And there's just, and in the same way, like once you start to commit to that style of management practice, everything just sort of snowballs there as well. Like you're locked into a high input stream, you're locked into artificial fertilizers. You can't bring in silvopasture because your trees are super, super close together and they're not tall enough to be outside the brower's height. And then you have to set up fences, and like that's never going to happen. So you're locked out of those choices. And yeah, I mean, I think to some degree, whenever you're doing something real, if you're being honest with yourself, there is a whole constellation of choices that you start locking yourself into, on the conventional side and on the non-conventional side. And so, yeah, our practice has really started to grow from that discovery of like, this is out there, this is really interesting. And again, the aesthetics are a huge part of that. Like, when I find an apple that does have a name, most of these orchards, like I'll never know what they're growing. They're so different from the same cultivar under conventional cultivation, that I will never be able to ID them. But sometimes we do find something like a wine sap or like a red delicious or something that is a fairly old variety. It has a name, somebody has kept the records together. And when I look at the sugar and the acid levels, we're like 20, 30, 40, 50% outside the normal range for those. And so it's an unrecognizable beast. And part of that means that it's a really, really interesting flavor that you've got to play with that way. And so, yeah, like the decisions all kind of come together, and lay out a path.
I have a follow-up question for you on that specific, but I want to hear Peter's answer to this question. Like, I've heard a couple of people say this aesthetic thing, and that's not an argument that like a lot of rationalist type thinkers use, but I feel like it's such a strong argument. But then also just like the practical realities that emerge on a small scale, like as a guy just trying to run a business. But what have been, I don't know, your guideposts, Peter, for that kind of question?
This is the question about like sort of conventional wisdom versus,
or just like, how did you decide to do the things, run your grass-fed beef operation in the way that you do? Like, how did it come to be that you didn't just run a conventional business and like, yeah, I guess just fundamentally, like, what's behind the philosophy? Is it aesthetic? I know for you, it's a lot environmental.
Yeah, I mean, I never planned on starting a farm. That was never my intention any time in my life I ever thought. I mean, even up until like a year before we started, when I was finishing my PhD, like that didn't even really cross my mind as an option for the future. I was like going to be a professor. Mm-hmm. So, my mission was to like restore ecosystems and to like help other people do that so it could happen at larger scales. And so starting a farm for me was just basically testing my own theory, which was that if we could manage a certain specific way that restored these ecosystems, we could produce meat and other products as profitable enterprises that could then sustain those ecosystems into the future. And that would provide livelihoods for the people that were necessary to do that work. So it was kind of just a test to see if that worked. And then, once I figured that out, then it was like, okay, well then, I got to choose some like key enterprises to like hold down the ship, right? I can't do like a little bit of everything. I've got to just like pick a few things. And so there's grass-fed beef. So it's like, okay, there's grass-fed beef. So then I like research all the people, Greg Judy and Joel Sell and all these guys have done grass-fed beef. And then there's, it's interesting because there's the conventional wisdom of, say, cattle farming. Like all my neighbors are like 70-plus-year-old guys that have been cattle ranching like their entire lives. And so they know a lot, right? But it's all conventional. And then there's the alternative, like the grass-fed or rotational grazing, which has been around long enough that there's kind of a conventional wisdom around that.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's almost become conventional. Like the pioneers that like write the first books, like everybody just copies them. And then there's like the way to do grass-fed beef.
Mm-hmm.
And, I do things a little differently because I have a different goal. Like my goal isn't just to produce grass-fed beef. I have these other goals. And the good thing about that is that in our systems, I get pretty immediate feedback. Like, usually within a year, if I try something, I'm going to know whether it worked or not. My animals are going to get fat or they're not. I'm going to every time I go to pick up meat from the slaughterhouse after a batch of steers has been processed, like I see their ribeyes and it's like immediate feedback. Like, did I do a good job finishing this batch of beefs or not? And we also have cows and calves. And every season I see their condition and their bodies and whether they have parasites or not, how much the flies are bothering. Like all these are feedbacks on my management. Like, am I doing a good job or not? And we do a lot of genetic advancement. So I cull a lot in order to be able to like have better genetics, and to basically make the genetics of our cattle over time like perfectly suited for our place. And if there's an animal that gets parasites and isn't thriving, well, I'm going to get those genes out of here as quickly as possible. And if there's one that's particularly just thriving in our environment, then I might save her calf as our next bull, herd sire. And so there's so many opportunities for feedback when we're actually like paying attention to what's going on, as opposed to, reading a book and following instructions like it's some kind of a manual, and then just going through the motions in our day, kind of clueless about, what the effects are. And so to me, like, being able to recognize and then act upon that feedback is like the most important part of my job, really. And being able to,
Totally.
discern what caused what, and then what I can do to improve going forward.
Yeah, I totally get that. I mean, we do something similar in terms of the apples that we find. As when we find these abandoned properties, what in some sense we're seeing is those individuals that can survive that kind of neglect. And by neglect, it just means experiencing the actual environment here without artificial support. And so like those are the genetics that you want to start looking at. And so we take cuttings from the wild trees that we find, especially the wild trees that are, they've never received an ounce of human care, and they've lived 60 years of California summers. Like those are the genes that you want to start bringing in. That's what you want to start building the next round of seedling rootstocks off of. And yeah, so we pay a lot of attention there as well, because again, like places are different. And I can't make that argument about the consumable side of things without also making that same argument about the actual experience of living in that place, needing different things and being fundamentally different.
I have kind of
go.
A funny story related to what you're talking about. We have a lot of wild apple trees around here, both wild crabs and standard apple trees. And for us, when I'm, doing setting up orchards around here, I like graft on the wild crab rootstock primarily, because like what else? I mean, it's so incredibly robust here. Like there's no disease. And
right.
The interesting thing here is that they've co-evolved for quite a while with heavy grazing, both from deer and cattle. And so you actually see them most often in pastures that were like heavily grazed, and then maybe didn't have cows for a few years, and then heavily grazed again. So like the seedlings got to get up above browse height, maybe like 15, 20 years ago. And now you've got this like beautiful orchard of wild trees. And I was consulting with a guy maybe 20 miles down the road who wanted to do, he was doing a silvopasture installation. He had an old hay field he wanted to plant fruit trees in. And so we're walking through this hay field and we're kind of deciding where things are going to go and what varieties we're going to use. And he's like, oh, I want to use M111s. He's like, that's my rootstock. I'm going to do M111s. I'm like, all right, whatever. That's cool. And I'm like, you do see all these wild apple seedlings shooting up in this hayfield right now, don't you? And he's like, no, what are you talking about? So I start pointing them out because on the other side of the hayfield was an old apple orchard, not an old apple orchard, but some wild apple trees. And then there were some woods on the other side. So the deer were crisscrossing back and forth all the time, planting wild apple seeds all over this hayfield. And he had never even noticed it because they always got cut. Well, it hadn't been, they hadn't gotten the first crop yet. So I'm like showing him, like, there's literally hundreds of wild apple trees. Like, you can graft onto these. Like, it's going to be okay. He's like, I want M111s.
God,
okay.
Yeah. I mean, and that's just such a key part of it. And I mean, the funny thing is, right now I'm getting most of my wild crabapple rootstocks that I graft onto as, 8-month-old seedlings. I'm actually getting them from a guy in like the northern Midwest, like I think he's in like Indiana or thereabouts. And what he focuses on is he breeds these trees for wild game managers. So these guys who have 10, 20,000 acres that they have trophy hunts on. And so they're paying attention to forage just like a conventional livestock grower is. And they want to, make sure that they've got like late winter forage for those bucks. And so this guy that I get the rootstocks from right now is one of the few people who is deliberately breeding and selling these totally wild crabapple rootstocks, and it's for game management.
That's so cool. So I have to bring this up, Brendan. So you and I disagreed on this thing, probably because you're more of a nerd about this than I am. But there was some like viral story about a guy who like saved, quote unquote, X number of apple varieties. And I was like, oh, look at how sweet this old guy is. He saved all these varieties. And Brendan was like, no, this dilutes our information. It wasn't like, I don't know. You tell me what your issue was with that, because I think it's probably important, and I conceded to you in the DMs that you're right, but let's litigate that, because I think it's probably important for both of you. Although on the other hand, like maybe the counterpoint is you don't even know what some of these varieties are that you're finding in these other orchards. But anyways, you tell me the important.
So I mean, for me it really comes down to a curation issue. And so my main problem with this is that when you see the story, it's like this wonderful clickbait feel good story, like everybody loves a quaint old horticulturalist. It's super sweet, and I think, I mean, in some ways that is an amazing like first step for a lot of people. Like, everybody has this visceral reaction of that is sweet, and that's like a wonderful stepping stone to get people more interested in this stuff. But as someone who is more serious than that first blush, when you click on his website and you get into his catalog, you wind up finding all of these factual errors, with like where he's claiming to have found the original tree for a variety that's very well documented as to where it came from, and never actually disappeared in the first place. And he's listing it as like, I found the original tree, I saved it from extinction. And it's like, dude, that's been cultivated. Like, you could probably get 5,000 or 10,000 acres of that across the US. Like, that never went away. And it just, you see that multiple times, and it essentially throws all of the other information into question, about like, okay, you claim to have found this really special variety that is extinct. The last time you said that, it was about something that wasn't extinct. How do I know you even ID'd this correctly? Like, it might be something else. You might have mislabeled this. Like, okay, like it's a yellow bellflower. Wonderful, but I can't take your word for that because you said the same thing about Arkansas Black, which never went away. And like, I don't know. So for me, it comes down to that like really, really granular data management side of like, if you are providing a service that is fundamentally corrupted information, it's not a service anymore. And yeah, so if it's a hobby project, if he just loves it, that's fine. But what winds up happening is like he's offering grafts and labeled scions and seeds from these varieties. And it winds up being, to my perspective, that he's polluting the informational environment around a topic that is already very, very cloudy. And there's a lot of, like we're growing an apple in our orchard that vanished for about 80 years until it was uncovered in New Jersey. And it's called the Harrison. And I think it's a really instructive comparison because the guy who rediscovered the Harrison spent 25 years confirming it. Like multiple decades focused on a single variety. And then there's this other guy who's like, I saved 1,200 different apples from extinction. And I think that's just a really instructive comparison of the effort involved in actually doing it right versus just being like, I found an apple and the guy who owned the tree said it was this, so it's this, and I'm putting it on my website and offering scions.
Yeah, I do think like there is like this weird thing happening right now, where academia is so discounted for so many things that people just like want to throw it all out, but that doesn't mean like a lot of there is good information and less good information. Peter, are you like a nerd about taxonomy at all?
No, I'm no. I appreciate it 100%. But yeah, like I don't get into the details and the weeds on that really ever.
Okay, so I think one point where I think you two, or maybe, I don't know what the sides will be, but maybe it'll be me and Peter against Brendan. But on technology and like human progress, I think that you and I, Brendan, have disagreed on some things, but I don't think I like understand more long form what your position is on like human progress in general. So I don't know, maybe let's talk about that for a second, and see if we can disagree a bit, because we've been agreeing, I think, too much on this podcast.
Bring the contention. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of our disagreement around that topic is to a degree kind of from that acceleration side of things. And like, I think one of the threads that popped into my head was, I don't even remember what started it, but I like had a picture of a 300,000-year-old Neolithic point. And I was like, this unconscionable change to the way of doing things cannot stand. Because like when you look into like Neolithic history, there's like a single style of making these points that kept people alive that lasted for like 25,000 years before anyone changed anything. And like that change was radical and deeply upsetting to someone. And I think we're living through the exact same thing. It's just a slightly more accelerated time frame. And I do think that that's really instructive to bear in mind, that I don't necessarily think that the neo-ludism thing is wrong, but I do think it's important to keep in mind that it's a reaction to front-loaded negative externalities of these technological changes. And those same negative externalities existed and have existed for our entire human history, right? Like, in order to experiment with a flint point, someone had to waste countless like flint nodes, chipping them wrong to everybody else's eyes. And like, at a certain point, like you have to accept that this is what we are. We are a creature that changes the world. And I understand the reaction against that, and I do think that it's a wise perspective. But I also think that if we only listened to that perspective, we would still be getting eaten by tigers. And that's honestly, like, that's where my my handle comes from. Is I was having a very similar argument with a friend about like these intractable social problems and like intractable problems and intractable this, and like you just can't solve it. And it's like, fuck it, like Literally, lions were an intractable problem for us for 1,000,000 years. Lions were a problem we didn't know how to solve, and now they all live in fucking zoos. And like, okay, maybe that's too far in the other direction, but this idea that we can't find a balance with our environment, that we can't find a balance with the pace of change, I think isn't true. And I think that if you make that argument, fundamentally what you're saying is that humans shouldn't flourish in our environment. Like realistically, like if we follow the Ludist argument all the way back to anarcho-primitivism, then there's 20,000 individuals living on the entire planet. They live to 35, and like I recognize you're right to make that argument, but I also think you're wrong.
They don't actually live to 35 though. That's just a fallacy that messes up the statistics because of child mortality. But I mean, okay, Peter, do you have a counter argument to that?
No, I mean, I essentially agree with that argument completely, but there's like another side though, because like, what is human thriving is like it's like 20, 30 something, like locked in a small apartment in a mega city, like strapped to VR all day to perform essential functions. Like, is that a thriving human? Like can technological development go too far and not actually solve human problems, but create more human problems and create
Absolutely.
less thriving? So
I totally agree there.
It's like weaving that needle, like trying to like get in between like the Luddite who wants like no technology for anybody and wants everybody to be like carding wool by hand to make their own clothing, versus like somebody locked in a mega city with VR to perform essential daily functions. Like there's got to be some intermediate ground where we can find some form of human thriving that includes like good technologies, but still values like the human being and like what makes us human, instead of valuing like technology as like the end point versus like a thriving human being as the end point.
Right. I think I totally agree there. And I think what I'm trying to say usually when I get into that in an inflammatory way on Twitter, is that's an argument that we've been having with ourselves for millennia, about like, the guy who invents the spinning jenny, like, is this human thriving? Like, it changes the way we were used to doing things. Like the guy who wasted countless pounds of flint trying to make a lighter point, like there were people next to him that were like, you were wasting everyone's resources, how fucking dare you? And it's a conversation that we will continue to have indefinitely. And I think that the main thing that is valuable is to remember that we're not going to solve it today. Like, and that's what I tend to see is like the reaction against says like, this is the solution and we can implement it immediately. And I don't think that's a realistic perspective. I think this is a conversation that we continue to have. We have these externalities that we start to see, and then we adapt our behavior. And I think that one of the main challenges is that the pace of change right now means that those externalities are making themselves known at a sub-generation scale, which is really where people start to get intense about things, right? When we have changes in the past, it can take 2, 3, 4 generations before we start to feel like, okay, this is maybe a shift too far, and we can shift back over the next 2, 3, 4 generations. And I think where people start to get super intense is that acceleration side of things, where the world of 10 years ago is unrecognizable today, and that's terrifying when you think about 10 years from now. And so this desire to have an immediate solution starts to take over the conversation.
Yeah, that I can admit that's it is useful to not just be reactionary, like just because there's some sort of change, and evaluate each change in and of itself. Like, is this actually solving any problems or not? I personally think most of the time it's making more problems than it's solving, but that I think it is useful to think on a case-by-case basis, like, is this actually helpful to us? Okay, yeah. So my final question, increasingly I am like coming across like big name policy level and or like, I don't know, people who pull the levers of power who are like getting involved in and or looking toward regenerative solutions. So I think of you two as like you should probably be secretary of like ag or whatever, both of you. I just think of like this cadre of people we have on Doomer Optimism who are like so thoughtful and should probably just be in charge because they're so thoughtful. I wonder if either of you have like any kind of thoughts you could lay out to somebody listening here who's like, you know, what do we do from here? Like, what do we do on scale? Like, what is the path from here to a regenerative future? Like, I know both of you are just kind of, you know, working on the scale of the thing that you're working on in your businesses, but like increasingly I'm seeing people and like sometimes people coming to me almost like desperate, like, what is the solution? And I'm feeling increasingly driven to articulate it clearly or ask other people on Doomer Optimism to articulate it. So I know it's a big question, but yeah, like what advice do you give to somebody like, I don't even want to put out a name, but you know, a big name person who has a lot of power and resources who's like, tell me what your vision is. How do we move toward the world you want to see? Who wants to go first?
Are you asking us to take an intractable problem and make it tractable? Is that what you're asking?
Yes. Even if it's just a set of heuristics, like, you know, that people should be following or something. I don't know. Like the part of the thing is like, you know, obviously I'll like talk for a second longer to give you a second to think, but obviously part of the problem is things like Sri Lanka or like, you know, Canada or whatever, where they're trying to implement a top-down solution very quickly and it's just not well thought out. And obviously a lot of the stuff has to be bottom up and experimented with, like takes time to relearn how to be humans in interacting with nature, et cetera, et cetera. But I still think like there probably are things that are able to be articulated for those who are interested.
Are you looking for realistic suggestions or unrealistic but probably more effective than realistic suggestions?
Let's say actually realistic, but with the help of somebody who actually has power and could implement some things. Yeah. All right, Brendan, go.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think in some ways it's a moot point. Like there are a lot of forcing mechanisms that are starting to ramp up that are going to drive that change. Like here in California, like I just read a paper that said that in the next decade, they're going to have to fallow 500,000 acres because of increasing salinity. And then with another million following that in the decade after. So, okay, 1.5 million acres going fallow because we're using artificial fertilizers and flood irrigation with high evaporation rates to water our crops. And like, that's a forcing mechanism. There are different ways of doing things that don't create those problems. And they're going to become more and more inescapable. You know, you've got saline intrusion into the aquifers because we're overdrawing them in like some places like Watsonville, Salinas, the South Central Valley. Like there's a solution there, and it's to use less water from the groundwater and more surface water in a smarter way. And like, again, that's dry farming, that's drip irrigation instead of flood irrigation. That's all of these things, increasing your soil carbon so that you hold moisture longer and you don't have to withdraw it as quickly. And I think there's a lot of forcing mechanisms that have a very holistic solution. And I think that the biggest issue on, I think, the policy side is that like any kind of top-down policy is anti-granular, right? Like basically by its very nature. And a lot of these places need granular solutions and have granular problems of like, you know, they have different infiltration rates, and maybe that means that they need to take a different approach to their water strategy. And I think the biggest single thing would be, I would say, stop propping up the people who are having those problems. Because the longer we find ways to supplement these systems that are failing, the harder the fall is when we can't supplement them any longer. The longer we're ignoring that forcing mechanism, the more energy is being built up in that spring, in that system to break loose. And yeah.
Peter?
Yeah, I mean, in absence of just like blowing up the government and like removing all of these, artificial structures that keep everything in a very non-natural state, maybe blow it up over a period of time so it doesn't kill so many people.
But that's the doomer side. What's the optimism? What's the creative? What do we?
Well, no, that is the optimistic side, because then I mean, there's so many barriers. Like, okay, so we need 10 plus million people out on the land growing food. Like, we just need that, like, yesterday, just in North America, if we want to be able to feed the people that are already here in some kind of reasonable way that's not going to completely destroy things, right? And we can't have, that's not going to happen overnight. That's going to take generations to accomplish. And so in a reasonable approach to things, we would sit back and look and say, like, okay, our system right now is really unsustainable. Like, we're destroying, all of our aquatic habitats. We're like, the soil is completely dead. We can repair all of that, but like, that's where it's at now. And we're losing topsoil at astronomical rates. So like, we have major problems for like long-term livability on this continent and on this planet, right? If we were to just say like, okay, tomorrow everything's got to change, like, it would be catastrophic, right?
Yep.
So we need to like ramp down and ramp back up, small scale, hands-on regenerative agriculture. But there are so many barriers to that as long as the system is operating the way it is. So as long as the system is operating the way it is, young people can't afford land. I mean, there's exceptions. You can like make it work, but it's very, very hard, right? And there's just so many barriers to that bottom up emergence that we're all kind of like hoping happens, as long as the ship in its current configuration is sailing along just fine. And so like, how do you sink that ship slowly enough that it doesn't like kill us all, and in a controlled way that allows for like an organic bottom up emergence of what we all know is possible? That would be, to me, a pretty intractable problem, because I don't see policy being even capable of, I mean, I'm sure there's little things you could do here and there that would help, maybe overcome certain barriers, but there's fundamental barriers, like we were talking about at the beginning of this conversation, with just the raw economics, like being able to like get on, say, 40 acres and make enough money selling something that you do in some kind of like organic regenerative way, making enough money to support a family is like next to impossible. And yeah, you could like make some policies, you could remove some agricultural subsidies, you could like subsidize homesteading, you could subsidize this and that. I'm skeptical of those as even being real solutions or even capable of addressing this problem, because the problems are so fundamental to just the way the whole system is built. Like, the only, it's like the system needs to come down, but that's so destructive that then it's like not, then we can't even, there's no customers left to sell things to, right? If the systems comes down in a day. So it's a tough problem. So for me, it's really like, it's at a very like personal level. It's like every human being needs to figure out for themselves where they're at and where they want to go and what the best means to get there is, because I don't think there is a real policy or top-down solution that's going to work in the time frame that we need it to work, and considering all the I mean, there's so many there's so much inertia in the system the way it is right now. Any policy changes around the fringes of that aren't going to change the fundamental direction that we're headed. So that means it goes down then to the individual level and just says, okay, well, what can I do with what I've got? And I think a lot about like generational wealth. And in the sort of like my generation and the millennials, there's not a lot of wealth. Like we're just like, everybody's renting, they're just barely making enough to like make ends meet. Meanwhile, there's like the boomer generation that's got stocks, they've got, you know, retirement accounts, they've got this wealth, right? And that is primarily located in the cities. And so I think a lot about how do we create mechanisms to basically transfer that wealth from the cities and from the boomer generations into the rural areas and into younger generations. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there, both at sort of like in just individual families of young people sort of like tapping into their network of friends and family and creating like investment opportunities, especially now because everybody's freaked out about the end of the world, and to have some kind of like a collapse insurance plan by giving, you know, this young kid who wants to go like restore some land and grow some food, by giving them like $5,000 or $10,000. Now I've got a place to go when shit hits the fan. There's just a ton of opportunities like that I think, you know, certain policies or like NGO activity could sort of help grease those wheels a little bit. But I think it ultimately needs to come up from the bottom up, and just more and more people that we need to figure out these problems and create opportunities for themselves. But I do think there is, if we're looking at policies, some opportunity to sort of help create mechanisms to make this transfer of wealth from the cities to the countrysides and from the older generations to the younger.
Yeah, I like that. And I would just add my 2 cents, which is the, you know, education component. I think like experiential education can be so fun. And like just thinking about something like these like Burning Man type get-togethers, but for things like barn raisings and cider tastings and apple pickings and all of this kind of fun stuff. Like, I do think that there's like a starting to be momentum, a wave of interest in these kinds of activities that are like more wholesome. And I think as people get a little bit more freaked out as they are, there's more and more demand for that. So we'll see if that goes in that direction. Maybe people will make some kind of more widespread educational institutions, or there'll be like a million you know, classes like you teach on your place, Peter, where people can come and learn hands-on how to do these things from people who have been experimenting with it for a while. I have one final thing that I need to ask Peter, because I need to let him defend his honor. The last podcast I recorded with Jason and a sustainable builder friend of mine, Matt Burke, Matt said at like over something like 400 something or maybe 500 parts per million, like your brain doesn't work well, that it's like something's going on where you're breathing and it and like it messes with your cognition. And then Jason said like, oh, Ashley, Peter Allen said 600 parts per million is some tropical paradise, and you love that so much. So then I said, Peter needs to be able to defend himself when you made a comment about 600 parts per million being I think the period of time where there was the most biodiversity or something like that. You didn't say anything about humans thriving.
I didn't say anything about humans with that. I'm just saying that's peak mammal diversity.
Yes,
when you look at the emergence of mammals 70 million years ago to now, the time on Earth when there were the most different kinds of mammals was 20 or so million years ago, and it was pretty high CO2.
Okay.
Now impacts on human cognition, that is not, I've never heard of that. My guess is if it happened in a short or in a long enough period of time, we could adapt pretty easily to that. Like there's a lot of plasticity in how we handle chemistry in our cells. So we should be able to, I could imagine taking somebody from like 350 parts per million and then putting them in a bubble with 600 would be very disorienting. But if it's happening, even in a generational time frame, that our cells would adapt to that. That's not something I would personally worry about. I don't think we're going to get to 600. I mean, I don't think I'm not advocating for that as some kind of a paradise. I never suggested that we should.
Good. Well, you know how these climate change.
All I was doing is that's just like a factual data point. I mean, that's just to consider among all of the other data points that we have around us.
Yes, and that's exactly.
I'd also point out that the 350, 400, 600 ppm is the global average, not necessarily what it's like being in a room, which I think is probably where that's coming from, is somebody with a CO2 meter who knows that when you hit 700, people get dumb. And I think it's important to point out that this is 2 miles of atmosphere over the entire globe average. It doesn't necessarily mean that 600 ppm is what you'd experience on the daily at ground level.
Yeah, well, and that's like the weird thing that always happens with these climate change debates is just like, well, if you say anything like that's against the narrative that it's just completely a catastrophe and everything is definitely going to be horrible and is definitely going to happen to this kind of catastrophic level, whatever, then it's like, oh, you're just like drill baby drill or whatever. So that was like, after your episode, I got into a few Twitter fights about this. I was like, Peter was just stating like an ecological fact. He wasn't advocating one way or another, and then whatever. So I wanted to give you a chance to
it's funny because I'll get into arguments as well with people, and then it's like I've built 2 inches of topsoil on over 100 acres. I've sequestered like millions of tons of CO2. Like I'm not some guy out there, like I'm not drilling oil wells.
I'm doing the opposite. I know.
I'm taking trees that would otherwise fall down and turning them into timber frames that's going to sequester this carbon for 500 years. Like I'm not like burning down the forests here or anything.
I know. I hate it. It's just there's lack of all nuance with these debates. But okay, Brendan, last word from you. How do people sign up to drink your cider? How do they find you? Plug your business.
PosterityCiderworks.com. We are allowed to ship to most states. We have a cider club that's 3 shipments a year. We have a charter club that is if you just love what we're doing and you want to get 15% off for life, you can do that one too without signing up for any bottle minimum. That's us. And then I wanted to say one last thing that I wanted to get into earlier when we were talking about like economies of scale and stuff. And I think this is probably a great opportunity to get cut off. But I think Jeffrey West of the Santa Fe Institute had a really interesting book about scales. And he uses, the mammoth and the mastodon, Peter's bros, as an example of creatures that benefit from economies of scale while simultaneously raising the capacity of the landscape. Whereas I think a lot of what we see is more of an invasive species sort of analogy where something is exceptionally well adapted to the landscape to the point of lowering the carrying capacity. And so I think that's something that's worth keeping in mind when we talk about like our businesses. How do we scale them? How do we explain to people that what we're doing costs more than the stuff that's artificially cheap, but it's better and it's more sustainable and it's probably a more realistic price to pay for stuff. And I think that's a valuable thing to bear in mind when we talk about like commerce and economies and how do we get more people doing this.
Awesome. I love that. And Peter, just drop your website too while we're at it.
Yeah, our website is mastodonvalleyfarm.com. We also have MacedonValleyFarmSchool.com, where we teach courses. We've got a course coming up, a regenerative farm design course. It's going to be awesome.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you both for coming on. You guys are on the list for the Secretary of Ag or whatever for the Consumer Optimism Federation of the future. So thanks. I appreciate it. This was so awesome. I'm so glad you both came on and got to meet each other too. Okay.
Yeah, for sure. It was a really fun chat.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks.